Joining me on Off the Record today is the author of the Rosabelle line and Chanakya'S Chant, Ashwin Sanghi, who's here for the launch of Chanakya'S Chant. It's a pleasure to be talking to you.
Likewise, Anuradha, it's a pleasure to be here.
You know, Ashwin has done something very unusual for the publicity of his latest book. He's created a very nice audiovisual presentation with a chant as the background score, because this chant is a very integral part of the book. So I was wondering if we can play that for our audience so they get a synopsis of the plot, because that's what this presentation is about.
Certainly.
As you would have figured by now, the book has two wily protagonists, two masters of machination. And Ashwin, the book is absolutely riveting. I'd like to read just a little bit from the book to tell you what these two men have in common. They believe that the source of livelihood of men is wealth, and the science of the means of attaining and protecting it is politics. So I'm thinking you should tell us your definition of politics, because I found it very amusing.
No, well, you know, at the launch yesterday, a gentleman asked me as to whether the Vish Kanyas who are mentioned in my book are actually can be found in today's politics. Because as you know, this book starts with a scene where a Vish Kanya is assassinating one of the kings. And I said, well, you know, I mean, if you look around you, the fact of the matter is that by my book, by my definition of politics, poly in Latin is many, and tix is blood-sucking creatures. So in any case, politics is all about many blood-sucking creatures all in the same place. So I'm sure if you look around you, you'd find enough Vish Kanyas in today's political environment.
So I would imagine that a staggering amount of research would have gone into this book, because if you look at the Chanakya portions, you have the early years of Vishnugupta, as Chanakya was known, the persecution and death of his father, the reasons for his self-imposed exile. You also have Alexander's invasion of northwestern India, and then the rebellion of the native Indian kingdoms to overthrow his successors after his death. You also have the overthrow of the Nanda dynasty and the crowning of Chandragupta Maurya as king. It's a vast sort of period. So, and you talk about fact that sounds like fiction. So the two questions here, tell us about the kind of research you did, and what is the balance of fact and fiction with regard to the Chanakya portions?
Okay. First, let me address your second question about fact and fiction. I think increasingly we are living in a world where when we read fiction, we want to read stuff that is as close to the truth. I think it was someone who said that if you're going to lie as close to the truth as possible. So as a fiction writer, obviously we are lying all the time because it's our imagination that's working overtime. But having said that, I wanted to make sure that the fiction sounds as real as possible. Conversely, of course, I think increasingly in our media savvy society, where we want instant gratification from our news channels, I think increasingly we are also living in a world where we want fact to sound like fiction. So we want sensationalism, we want, you nowadays have news clips which have extremely dramatic background scores happening, you know, so that's very much part of that merging of fact and fiction. Coming to the question regarding research, as you know, there are two parallel tales in Chanakya'S Chant. One is the ancient story, which is 2,300 years ago, and one is the modern day story, which is a contemporary story. As far as the ancient story is concerned, I obviously needed to try and get to know as much as possible about my main protagonist. that is Chanakya himself. And unfortunately, in the case of Chanakya, even though we have the Arthashastra, which is authored by someone called Kautilya, but whether Kautilya was the same person as Vishnugupta and whether Vishnugupta was the same person as Chanakya only comes across through the Panchatantra almost about 200 years later. It's Vishnu Sarma who for the first time says that these three people are the same. Majority of what we know about Chanakya's life actually comes through the Sanskrit play Mudra Rakshas, which was authored sometime between 400 and 900 AD, which was a good 700 to 800 years after the times of Chanakya. So even though there's a lot written by Chanakya, there's very little written about Chanakya's life. But you know, surprisingly, that is what is interesting for someone like me who's a writer of fiction, because the more gaps there are, it's like you have two pieces of bread and you can make a sandwich. Now you can pretty much decide what the filling is.
But did you also have the trouble of handling too much material, because that can be a problem?
Oh,
too
yes.
less is a problem, but too
Absolutely.
much.
But I would say in the case of Chanakya's chant, that was not the case. With the Rosabal line, it was very much the case of just trying to figure out, okay, how much can I pack in? With Chanakya's chant, that was not the case. Partly the reason it was not the case was because I was dealing with a topic which was not likely to be extremely sensitive. So whereas my first book dealt with religion and theology, this one deals with politics. And whereas the first one was meant to be an educating book, it was the primary objective of the book was to be able to convey a story through the medium of fiction. The primary objective of the second book is purely an out and out entertainer. So if I can succeed in getting you to read from page 1 to page 415 without taking a break, then I would say that I have done my job as an author.
You said yesterday that the Arthashastra is such an interesting text, and
Yes.
It should be prescribed reading in schools because it contains such a wealth of knowledge and something that is so old. So will you tell us some of the findings as you read it?
Well, you know, what is very interesting is that we know Chanakya primarily for his realpolitik. We know him for Chanakya Niti, as it were. The ruthless, the cunning, the clever, the intelligent, the scheming mind of Chanakya is what is famous. And that is why we very often call Chanakya the Indian Machiavelli, which I think is a misnomer, because Machiavelli himself was 1800 years after Chanakya. So if at all, one can say that Machiavelli was the European Chanakya. But having said that, I think what is missed out very often is the fact that this was the author of one of the greatest works on governance, the Arthashastra. And it is incredible to read a work written 2300 years ago, where the attention to detail in day-to-day mundane matters of governance are specified as if it's a top-notch consultant from McKinsey who's prescribing what needs to be done by an organization. So for example, how should a chariot road be built in order to make sure that it survives? What should be the width of a chariot road so that one chariot can overtake another? How should drinking dens, liquor pubs be managed so that they don't go out of hand? How do you prevent adulteration of food? Chanakya was not one of those people who was trying to reform the world. He saw the world as it was. So he saw all the vices as they were. His intention was not to say, well, don't drink. He said, well, you know, drinking is going to be there. Can I make the government earn money out of it? So can I tax them? Or for example, even a vice like prostitution is attended to in the Arthashastra.
You know, when we come back after a short break, Ashwin will tell us how history repeating itself is not necessarily a good thing, because that's what Chanakya'S Chant is all about. Stay tuned. I'm in conversation with author of Chanakya'S Chant and the Rosabal line, Ashwin Sanghi.